Right. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning for Human Rights Day at BLS. My name is Mr. Chen, and I'm the assistant head of school. And today I'll be joined by Ashley Tran and Thomas Tran, two TOEFL fellows. One of the most interesting things about today is I've never actually been in a Zoom room that's hit its max where we've needed to do a overflow room on YouTube. And, I think that really underscores how this Human Rights Day is unique compared to years past. Particularly since we're all remote and joined together by Zoom. It's kind of a daily reminder of how all of us have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, even though everyone has had various levels of impact by the pandemic, what we wanted to talk about today is particularly around one particular group of people living in the United States, Asians and Asian Americans, that have experienced a particularly insidious form of racism as a result of the narrative that has emerged about the virus. Today, we've prepared the next 30 minutes or so to contextualize some of these racist acts and talk about the larger historical pattern of anti-Asian discrimination in US history. To get us started, Ashley is going to talk a little bit about some of these ideas.
So to begin, I would like to show you all a video which is quite satirical about the prevailing narrative or most recent standpoint of anti-Asian discrimination within the context of COVID. And this video was uploaded by Ryan Higa, who is a prominent Asian American comedic YouTuber. And if you've seen Ryan's videos in the past, you might be able to expect what type of humor he uses, but if you aren't familiar with him, just expect a lot of satire and over-dramatized humor. So let's take a look.
While COVID-19 infections continue to ramp up here in the United States, so have the reported hate crimes against Asian Americans. But is this phenomenon something that is helpful to the pandemic, or is it something that we've all misunderstood? They're being beaten, their properties defaced. Why there's a huge spike in Asian American hate crimes here in the US during this pandemic, I spoke with Dr. Cyan Teese of the American Central Health Ops Organization to find out exactly why. So why do you think there's been such a large increase in violence towards Asian Americans? Well, the coronavirus was reported to have started in Wuhan, China, which according to our research is in fact an Asian country. Right. Therefore, here in the US, we believe that if people started to contract the virus locally, it would be at the fault of the Asians here, the Asian American people. However, after extensive research, we've made some new incredible discoveries, and one of them is that there's actually a geographical difference between the Asian Americans living here in the US and the Asian people living in Wuhan, China. Really? How big of a difference are we talking? About 11,640 kilometers, or a little over 7,200 miles. Wow, that is a great distance, and you are sure of this? My team and I have ran tests after tests on Asian Americans, and each time they come back positive for being Americans living here in the US and not in China. I mean, some of them have never even been to China. It's amazing. How is that even possible? That is incredible. You will not believe the things we're finding. We're starting to see patterns that not all Asian Americans are even Chinese. No.
Yeah, so I hope you guys kind of got a gist of the humor that I was talking about earlier. But anyways, as comical and amusing this video may seem at first glance, let's take a look at the bigger message Ryan is trying to send out to his audience. For example, he makes some very obvious and over-dramatized statements, such as the incredible discovery that Wuhan is 7,200 miles away from the US, or how people connect the dots in ways that make them believe that because the virus started in Wuhan, it's at the fault of the Asians here in the US. And yeah, you can easily brush this off and be like, nice joke, but if you take the joking aspect away from it, you can really see how absurd some of the recent sentiments against Asian Americans have been. And the obvious statements that Ryan is trying to make here really emphasize how there's no justification for any of the racist incidents going on, and it's just the root of xenophobia and overall fear. And taking this very literal theme, we can transition into our next slide. So a very recent phrase that's been used quite often, particularly by former President Trump, is the Chinese virus or Chinese flu, Kung flu. You've heard them on the news. And I'm sure you've also heard arguments of why these phrases aren't racist. But here is a very blatant comparison of the official name of the virus versus the insult and its effects. And on the right-hand side, you can see that the only reason anyone would be using these phrases is to reinforce the idea in people's heads that there is some outside group that is the cause of this virus, and it's their fault, and they should take responsibility. And this type of othering language is essentially a blame game that just emphasizes stereotypes that have been around for years, and it spreads this xenophobia and fear of this other group. And unfortunately, people act on these fears in the form of hate crimes. So on that note, I'll transition to Mr. Chen.
So what's the actual impact of our leaders and people in our society framing the narrative around the origins of the coronavirus using phrases like Kung flu or Chinese virus? As Ashley mentioned, a lot of times these things are brushed off as, people can't take a joke, or, don't take yourselves too seriously. But the data that we actually have is pretty clear here, that since the virus emerged in the United States in March 2020, we've had almost 2,800 reported incidents of racism and discrimination against Asian Americans across the United States. Some of these incidents are verbal, where you'll hear people using racial slurs. Other times they're actually acts of violence towards Asians. And just to kind of put this data point in comparison, we also looked at what the Department of Justice had for statistics around hate crimes on the basis of race. And the last full year of data that we have is actually from 2019, where the DOJ reported that there were just fewer than 4,000 reported hate crimes on the basis of race, ethnicity, or ancestry all across the United States. So when you keep this in mind that this data does not include unreported incidents or those that occurred outside of the United States. So although our data is a little bit more limited outside of the US, we also do have a couple of data points from other countries such as Australia, the UK, and India, which clearly indicates that there has been a sharp rise in the number of incidents, reported hate incidents against AAPI people since this narrative has started to be framed in the way that we've talked about. But of course, one of the other things that we've also heard about is, well, how do we know that this is actually coming, like this language that we're using is actually the cause of a lot of these incidents? So there was also a study that was published in February 2020 that found something called the emboldening effect, which is essentially this idea where people are more likely to express their prejudices and act on them after they've heard their leaders express them. So in other words, these jokes, these contextualizing of ways to shift the blame to where this virus comes from actually means that it turns out that what your teachers taught you in elementary school is true. Words actually do matter. So what does this mean actually in the context of coronavirus and what we're seeing with this rise in anti-Asian hate? Well, in actuality, when you look at the history of the United States, this sharp rise in anti-Asian rhetoric and actions, they're deeply concerning, and it's important that we directly confront and interrupt these acts happening now. But in order for us to truly understand how troubling this rhetoric has been, it's critical to understand that the attacks on Asian people living in the US is part of a larger pattern of anti-Asian racism rooted deep in the history of the United States. And for that, Thomas is going to talk a little bit about some of those incidents.
So yeah, just before I delve into this timeline, which is very, very brief, all of these topics could easily be expanded on, but unfortunately, we just don't have the time for that. So I'm going to start. History of discrimination has been prevalent throughout Asian American history, starting with the California Gold Rush in the 1850s. Chinese workers came over to try their luck at the California Gold Rush, but were quickly discriminated against due to the language and culture barrier, as well as their willingness to take on jobs for lower wages. So when the gold rush finished and some were left unsatisfied with the amount of gold discovered, they quickly blamed the Chinese for quote unquote stealing the remaining resources, which soured relations even more. And quickly after the gold rush ended, the Chinese workers found themselves with a problem. How would they make a living now? Conveniently, the Transcontinental Railroad was being built and needed laborers. The Chinese, as well as Irish immigrants, took up this role. Still then, the Chinese workers found themselves doing more dangerous work, in harsher conditions, and with lower wages. They tried striking, but the officials just cut the food sources off until they had no choice but to work. And to top it all off, they were not even included in the commemoration photo, never credited for their work. In addition, Chinatowns were created from the marginalization of the Chinese. They were forced into the grungy, dirtier areas and were prohibited from living anywhere else. This also served as protection, however, as there could be potentially dangerous situations in the unfamiliar land. However, in 1877, a large white mob stormed the San Francisco Chinatown and lynched 4 Chinese men. Of course, not much was done about it, and it still remains as one of the most notorious hate crimes against the Chinese. But one of the biggest pieces of history is the Chinese Exclusion Act that was signed in 1882. This banned the immigration of all Chinese laborers and remains the only law, or was the first and remains the only law that banned all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. In the next slide, we're going to go deeper into the Chinese Exclusion Act. But even now, you might be hearing echoes of our more recent political environment, where we saw executive orders banning travelers from certain Muslim majority countries.
So yeah, as Thomas just mentioned, this act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, banned immigration on Chinese laborers. And it was constantly reformed and extended, as you can see on this slide. But rather than going through what each reform entails, I think it's even more important to understand the context of this. Like, why did this happen? What led up to this? Why did the government think it was okay? And even how does it affect current events? So if you notice in the timeline from the previous slide, there was already a buildup in anti-Asian hate. You have this influx of new workers who are willing to work for lower wages, which is already a difficult position to be in when you're trying to make a living in a new country. And so there's this competitive atmosphere where the whites in America feel threatened, and they feel that, and there's all these labor disputes and a fright that the Chinese will take all the jobs in California. And so the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And keep in mind that this remains one of the only laws that banned all members from a specific ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. And the sentiment was ongoing. Like, look how long it lasted. It lasted from 1882, and it wasn't repealed until 1943. And this not only affected the people who were prohibited from entering the country, but the Chinese Americans and future Asian Americans who were already here. You couldn't leave the country, there was prevention from gaining citizenship, and you had to carry certain specific identification at some points. And this was all because we, and I'm using we loosely here, thought that setting up a blockade would solve our economic troubles because it's the fault of the Asians because they are a threat to our economy and they were a threat to our jobs and they were a threat to the American people. And similar themes are bleeding into current day events. I mean, here we are around 150 years later, and the US is having the same arguments about what to do with immigration and are still arguing about what policies to implement to combat some of our problems. And so if you look at this cartoon on the right-hand side, you can see a familiar phrase about this wall building that are surrounding our borders. And that's something that's really prevalent today within the discussion of immigration. And that's just something to keep in mind. Just remember that the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act isn't only the history that sets the tone for anti-Asian discrimination for the next couple of years, but one that sets the tone for xenophobia for years to come.
Now we head back into the timeline. So in 1885, a mob of several hundred white men forcibly removed the Chinese population from Tacoma, Washington. This was clearly racially motivated, for they wanted to keep their community quote unquote clean. This was not very uncommon, unfortunately, and there were also several other cities that forced Asian Americans out of their cities. It's just another case of blatant discrimination in history. And by the 1900s, San Francisco Chinatown had become, and I quote, notoriously corrupt, dirty, and overcrowded. And in a stroke of unfortunate events, an outbreak of the bubonic plague occurred from 1900 to 1904, in which Chinatown was put under strict quarantine. There was no visitors allowed in or out. However, it went to the extreme and they didn't provide food for the residents. In addition, it only further supported the stigma of the Chinese being dirty and disease-ridden. This has parallels to the COVID-19 today, as Asian Americans all over are targets of hate crimes, despite not even being near the origin, yet still holding that same stigma. And we move further along down the timeline, and after the attacks on Pearl Harbor during World War II, the anti-Japanese sentiment was very prominent. President FDR issued an order that forced all Japanese Americans to enter the internment camps that had harsh conditions and prohibited leaving. There are many layers of why this is wrong and harmful, and we will touch upon that in the next slide. Mr. Chen?
Thanks, Thomas. So a lot of you have probably heard a little bit about the Japanese internment camps, but just for a little bit of background, on February 19th, 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized what like military zones of exclusion that essentially could exclude people based off of their ancestry. So in the context of World War II, what this executive order ostensibly allowed for was the internment of Japanese Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans, largely because of espionage concerns. But the important thing to note, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, is it's really infamous for how it impacted the Japanese community and the Japanese American community. So as you've seen so far in this timeline, there was already significant anti-Asian sentiment through legal acts, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Which actually mentioned that it was repealed in 1943. Ironically, it was repealed when China joined the Allies in World War II. So in other words, it was, well, I guess we're going to let Chinese immigrants in, but now we're going to start interning Japanese citizens, right? And this is sort of a larger pattern of anti-Asian sentiment that had been happening far before World War II. Before this, Asian immigrants were prohibited from owning land in the United States through a law called the Alien Land Act. And just to kind of give you an idea of how insidious some of this was, there was also an 1854 court case that was based out of California, which held that Chinese immigrants could not testify in trials against white citizens. So in that particular case, a white man was accused of murdering a Chinese immigrant named Ling Xing, and 3 other Chinese people witnessed it. That white defendant was convicted, but appealed on the basis that those 3 witnesses could not testify against his trial, which essentially meant that the only way that a person could get away with murdering a Chinese person so long as there were no other white people to witness it. If there were only Asian people that witnessed it, you couldn't be convicted of a crime. So to really put this in context, it's really important to note that the impact of this executive order, even though Germans and Italians could also be interred, it was most felt by Japanese Americans. Between 1942 and 1945, there were nearly 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were interred, compared to just 11,000 Germans and 3,000 people of Italian ancestry. This internment camp, this plan also resulted in one of the most infamous US Supreme Court cases. Some of you might have heard of Fred Korematsu in a case called Korematsu versus the United States. In that case, which is generally regarded by most legal scholars as one of the worst decisions in US Supreme Court history, a majority of justices upheld the internment of Japanese Americans because of the need to protect against espionage. That need outweighed the rights of Americans of Japanese descent. But one important thing to note is out of the 120,000 Japanese Americans that were interred in these concentration camps, 2/3 were American citizens, and there was not a single case of any person interred actually being found guilty of espionage. So that leads us to the next slide, which talks a little bit about just kind of to give you a flavor of some of the sentiment that was happening in the culture. So the first you'll see is that there's a quote from General John L. DeWitt, and he says, "I'm not concerned with what they do with the Japanese as a whole, just so long as they are not allowed to return to the West Coast." General DeWitt was the actual military commander who ordered all the Japanese out of the West Coast. In addition, you'll actually see a cartoon right underneath that, and this might actually look pretty familiar to you. It's actually by the children's book author Dr. Seuss. And in this cartoon, what you'll see is a line of Japanese-looking people in a very stereotypical manner, all coming from California, Oregon, or Washington. And they're going into a little hut that has a sign that says the Honorable Fifth Column. Just to give you a sense of what that means, the fifth column is a term for any group of people who undermine a larger group from within, usually in favor of an enemy group or nation. And of course, you see that caption, "waiting for the signal from home." In other words, implying that doesn't matter how long you have been in the United States, doesn't matter if you're a 2nd or 3rd generation Japanese, many of whom were interred, you could never have full allegiance to being American so long as you were also Japanese, of Japanese ancestry. And finally, the last thing, and I really wanted to highlight this as well, is this also comes from a Los Angeles Times column from February 1942. And I want to read this quote in its entirety. And it's really important to keep in mind as we talk through Thomas's next section, which is this quote from 1942 during World War II says, "No matter where born, there is unfortunately no doubt whatever. They are for Japan. They will aid Japan in every way possible by espionage, sabotage, and other activity, and they will need to be restrained." I want you all to keep this quote in mind to see what happens to the narrative around Asians in the 20 years after World War II.
So, following the timeline we showed earlier, we now fall on to the model minority myth, which some of you guys may heard. And what's really interesting about this is how drastic the sentiment of Asians changed over the course of 20 years. As Mr. Chen was just talking about, around the time of World War II, you had a severe and explicit distrust against Japanese Americans. But by the 60s, and honestly current day, there's been this misleading praise with seemingly positive attributes and stereotypes of the Asian population. So what exactly happened? Well, let's look at a bit of context. What else was happening during the 60s in America? There was also the civil rights movement. So what exactly does this mean? It's hard to pinpoint an actual reason for anything, but just some food for thought. What do you guys think could happen when you have the Black population in America fighting for their rights after years of racism and discrimination, alongside a praise of the Asian American population? And essentially, this praise wasn't just Asian Americans are financially stable, they are law-abiding citizens and such like that. It really extended to, look, the Asians were once discriminated and now they're doing well. Why? What's the case and why can't you do the same? But I'm going to transition to Thomas so he can go a bit more in depth.
So yeah, in 1966, the term model minority was born and coined in the New York Times Magazine by writer William Pearson in his piece titled "Success Story, Japanese American Style." He rewrote the narrative of AAPI multiracial dynamics in a dangerously divisive way. He pointed to examples of financially successful AAPI who supposedly overcame discrimination through work ethic, centering the family, Confucian values, and even genetic superiority. And this story has been perpetuated into our nation or our national culture for over decades. But fundamentally, it is a myth. The myth characterizes Asian Americans as docile, law-abiding group who have achieved a higher level of education and financial success than the general population. Serving as a quote-unquote standard for other minorities to reach, it allows Asian Americans the opportunity to receive temporary privileges in society in exchange for upholding white supremacy. Model minority paints a picture of Asian Americans as wealthy and fully assimilated into white culture, which diverts the attention from AAPI who are struggling. So issues like language access, deportation, mental health support, and police brutality issues aren't focused in the discussion about Asian Americans. So even though it may seem like an accolade, the model minority myth is extremely harmful. This is only enforced further by the 1970 New York Times article titled "Orientals Find Bias is Down Sharply in the US," where Jay Chuan Chu, an Asian American immigrant, gave his advice to, quote, adapt to the American way of speaking, dressing, and doing things in order to fit in and succeed in America. The article only briefly touches upon the discrimination faced and equates it to a denial of a country club. The underlying tone of the article was, if they can, why can't you? However, before this, Asian Americans were the yellow peril, the perpetual foreigner, and seen as undesirable in every way. So as we can see, Asian Americans' membership in American society is still very conditional, as seen with the rise of anti-Asian sentiment with the COVID-19 pandemic. Society chooses which side of the coin to use when viewing Asian Americans, which pigeonholes the community into these two categories. American society claims Asians when it's convenient and rejects them when it's not. Not only does it erase inequity that exists within the broad Asian American community by creating a monolithic identity for Asian Americans, it is also weaponized to disprove the existence of systemic racism, systemic racism, and reinforces a structure in which assimilation into white society is a primary goal for all ethnic groups. And what I talked about so far was how the model minority myth affects Asian Americans. However, there's detrimental impact on other oppressed groups as well. As Ashley mentioned earlier, the timing of the model minority myth was not merely a coincidence, as it was purposely fully coined and popularized during the civil rights movement. It was a tactic to showcase and uplift the success of one minority group while the other was fighting for equality and rights. So the undertones of "if they can, why can't you" was not aimed just at other Asian Americans. It was also served to discredit the Black community. As a result, however, this created a divide between the Asian American and the Black community, despite the history of shared efforts for solidarity together. History textbooks never mentioned these Asian American activists, despite the messages that they were conveying and the solidarity that they were building.
So let's go back to this timeline. And it's really important to note that this is not an exhaustive list, nor is it actually intended to be representative of anything except we could have easily gone back and found 8 other incidents that illustrated a pattern that hopefully you're starting to see emerge. So during the beginning of the gold rush, Chinese labor was needed and welcomed. But as the supply of gold began to reduce, white laborers began to view Chinese as competitors, taking away scarce resources. You could see a similar cycle of blame begin to arise during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, where we needed to build the infrastructure and we needed people to come in and build until one day it was, you're taking all of our jobs, right? So each time Asians are welcomed until it's no longer convenient, either legally, politically, or societally, for the dominant power structures in the US. And so the legal and political response when that happened was often blame and exclusion, where you saw the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? In the form of creating Chinatowns to restrict the movement of Asians and entirely excluding people from entering into the country. From creating Japanese internment camps and then ultimately welcoming Asians back in using the model minority myth in order to use it as a wedge against other groups of color. And that brings us to the present day, which if we were to add on to this timeline, what we're seeing right now with the coronavirus pandemic and the way Asians are being discussed and treated is just another example and the latest example of something that we're seeing throughout throughout history. What does it mean when you have a leader who intentionally and explicitly calls the virus the Chinese virus? What does it mean when you have someone who touts a travel ban from China as the action that solved the pandemic? As was said in July of 2020, when Donald Trump said, we would have had thousands of people additionally die if we let people come in from heavily infected China, but we stopped it. We did a travel ban in January. By closing up, we saved millions, potentially millions of lives. And this picture up here was actually intentionally chosen. It's not a random stock photo. It's actually the exact speech that the former president actually brought forward to his podium to read out loud in front of millions of Americans, where you'll see right there that crossing out Corona and adding the word Chinese. On its own, all of these are deeply troubling and dangerous rhetoric that's caused the rise of anti-Asian incidents throughout this country. However, when we think about it in the historical context, it's part of this larger pattern of blame and exclusion that happens to communities of color, and in particular, in this moment, Asian communities, whenever there's a scapegoat that's needed. So what can we do about this? Where do we go from here? Well, as hopefully as you've seen, the roots of this anti-Asian rhetoric and action coursing through the United States since the pandemic hit, they're not new. It's part of that larger pattern of exclusion and blame that has those deep roots. This presentation, as I noted, was simply a brief review of select incidents where people of Asian descent have been blamed and excluded from the equal protection of laws in the United States. So as we approach and pass that year mark since COVID-19 has impacted all of our lives, that anti-Asian rhetoric and the anti-Asian actions have not gone away. And it's critical that everyone here that's watching this, all of us play a critical role in disrupting that pattern of racism that didn't just begin in March of 2020, but rather since the inception of this country. Here are just a few ways that you can do that. So the first one is to really educate yourself and others. you'll see that a lot of the work, and as Thomas mentioned, a lot of the work in history of Asian Americans often isn't talked about. So learn about this. Learn about the historical roots of anti-Asian racism and the United States and understand that they go far beyond our present moment in time. Understanding this history and how it impacts us today is critical to disrupting those discriminatory and racist acts.
Another way you can be an upstander is to actively interrupt and disrupt acts of racism and discrimination when you can. If you're ever in a situation when you hear something that is rooted under ignorance or discrimination, interrupt. Next, question their attention and identify what assumptions were being made. Then, educate. Explain why their action needs rethinking. And lastly, echo the voices of others and have the back of other upstanders and allies to amplify the message of unity.
But from our presentation and the others may have seen or will see today, many issues circle back to one particular topic: white supremacy. White supremacy is the root cause for many issues within various BIPOC communities. And this means that even if one group does not feel the impact of the other's issues, they're very interconnected. Until white supremacy is dismantled, these issues will never truly be resolved, and more might spring up in their place. Given what we know about the systemic oppression of Asians, as well as how it affects other marginalized communities, we can and have realized that Asians are a part of a larger struggle for racial justice. And this is why solidarity goes beyond let's help the BIPOC because they need it. And instead it's my fight is your fight, and this is all just the same fight. Thank you for attending our presentation today, and we appreciate all the attention.